Новый аппарат управления в лице советских организаций. Отныне наступает новая полоса в истории России. И данная третья русская революция должна будет в своем конечном итоге привести к победе социализма.
For the topic of the Bolsheviks gaining power over Russia, there are four main sections of information you need to learn. There's the ineffectiveness of the provisional government, the successes of the Bolsheviks, the economic and political policies, and finally the Civil War.
The provisional government had many failures, but some of the most important were deciding whether or not to continue the war effort, how to distribute land to the peasants, and how best to get the food for the starving workers of Russia. The provisional government, firstly, chose to continue the war effort even though the whole of Russia was starving, poor and freezing. With the peasants of Russia not having enough land to make a living out of it, the provisional government chose to wait until after elections before distributing land to the peasants. Finally, the provisional government had to get food to the people of Russia as they were starving from the Tsarist regime. The provisional government, instead of focusing on the right feeding Russia, they prioritised the war effort, which was using food, petrol and money that the people of Russia desperately needed. The decisions made by the provisional government regarding the war effort, land and food, made the job of gaining power a whole lot easier, as they were disliked by the people of Russia due to their poor decisions.
One thing that the Bolshevik Party did really well was appealing to what people wanted to raise support. For example, starving people had no benefit from the war, so they, unlike any other party, said that they would get out of the war if they were to become in power. They knew eventually that Germany would lose to the Allies, and so they'd get back their money. For example, the 6 billion gold marks from the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that they handed over. And also, they appealed for bread, peace and land, which everyone wanted, as they were basic needs for life. Trotsky and Lenin were also popular in raising support. Their party was tightly controlled, with lots of discipline, order and unity. Throughout this time, Lenin worked on the editorial board of Pravda, a newspaper that they used as a way of letting people hear about them and their ideologies. They often compared themselves to other real-life examples, making themselves seem a worthy cause, as they were one of the Russian people. The provisional government had no real power after Lenin had declared all power to the Soviets. This meant that the Bolsheviks could redirect any actions that were going to go against them. When Kornilov turned the army on Petrograd, Kerensky gave weapons to the Bolsheviks in order to defend themselves from them, since Kerensky had very little support left. The army weren't prepared to fire, and so this half made the Red Guards. These Red Guards had support of the Kronstadt sailors, as well as around half the army. And with these, the November Revolution could occur, in which Trotsky took control of the entire Petrograd city overnight, including the Winter Palace. When the provisional government finally was gotten rid of, they didn't have a majority in the National Assembly. However, the Red Guards broke this up so that the Bolsheviks could truly be in power.
Now you can see Lenin did a lovely job of getting into power, but now once he was in power, he wanted complete control to consolidate his power. He did this through economical means. For example, war communism meant that he could nationalise businesses, control the banks and industries. On the 1918, in September, he began the Red Terror. So the Cheka seized grain from the countryside and brought it into the cities. This led to black market sales and starvation across the country, unfortunately. This led to the war communism being no longer relevant. Lenin was clever though, so he brought in his new policies, the new economic policy. This was due to the Kronstadt mutiny. This basically meant the return of capitalist aspects in Russia. For example, private ownership was returned, private trading allowed, and the sales of surplus grain was once again returned. This created a whole new sector in society named the kulaks. Plus, Lenin created the Constituent Assembly to meet popular demand. This did lead to problems, however, as the social revolutionaries won the election, leading to Lenin having to close it down in the end. Lenin also set up several Bolshevik decrees to please the masses, such as the land, peace, workers, self-determination and army decrees.
One of the greatest challenges in the Bolshevik consolidation of power was the Russian Civil War. In my view, there were four main reasons why the Reds were able to win the Civil War: diplomatic, military, industrial, and infrastructure and social. Firstly, they made peace with Germany in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which allowed them to concentrate all their effort on fighting the Whites, instead of trying to fight an unpopular war against a much stronger, larger, and experienced German army, as well as the Whites. Arguably one of the most important reasons why the Bolsheviks were able to survive the initial White advance was their unity, both geographically and politically. They had their heartlands in the more developed industrial centre of Western Russia, including cities that usually have more pro-Bolshevik populations. The Bolsheviks also had key advantages like good lines of communication and transport, as well as control over key industrial and agricultural areas to bolster the war effort through war communism and sustain a war far better than the Whites, who had control over large but undeveloped and rural areas. The Red Army was also led by the charismatic and popular Trotsky, who was also a convincing orator. Trotsky made sure that the Red Army had good commanders, including ex-Tsarist officers, which reduced any incompetence in leadership. Troops were also better disciplined than the Whites, fearing the checker and the guarantee of execution if they disobeyed orders. By contrast, the Whites were disunited and lacked a common goal or overall commander, and so could be attacked and removed one by the Red Army. The final reason for the victory of the Bolsheviks was the support of the peasants and the majority of the army, which helped them feel the bigger force than the Whites. The amount of troops that can be recruited was also much higher than the Whites because of the higher population density of Bolshevik-controlled areas. Recruitment was also aided by the fact that although some people were fighting for the ideals of Bolshevism, most were only fighting because all the best food and pay went to the army. People were also convinced by effective propaganda that the Whites would bring about the return of the landlords and the Tsar, and were in league with foreign controlling forces. Although many people were wary of the Bolsheviks, they saw them as the lesser evil to the chaotic Whites. The White armies also, in general, committed more atrocities as they needed to rely on raids more than the Reds to support their weaker production capabilities, which made them much less popular.